All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out, you guys. I got another banger for you guys. But before I get into this story, let me just make a quick announcement real quick. I just want to start this out by sending my condolences to Iron Bear's family. As some of you probably know by now, Iron Bear met his untimely demise this past week, these last couple of days. I'm still trying to digest what happened myself. I mean, this right here should be a reminder to all of us that tomorrow's not promised. You can be here 1 minute and you can be gone the next. You know, he'd been texting me all week asking me if I wanted to do another live with him. And I had been kind of blowing him off because I was trying to put some of these stories in context that I've been working on these last couple of days. However, I told him, yeah, we'll do another live in the next couple of days. I'll get back at you. Now I'm kind of regretting that I didn't do one with him. It's something small that I took for granted, but when you have an opportunity to do something, do it, because you'll never know when that opportunity's gone and you might not never get another chance to do it again. And even though there's a lot of people in this world that cry and moan and whine about the problems that they have in life, Iron Bear had a lot of problems. He had a lot of health issues, but he always had a smile on his face and he never let any of that stuff weigh him down. So again, rest in peace, Iron Bear. And I'm not really a religious guy, but if there is another side, bro, I'll see you when I get there. So anyways, like I said, I got another story for you guys. And this story right here is about a prominent Mexican mafia member that I'm sure a lot of you have already heard about before in the past. So Mike Lerma, who's also known as Dogmouth or Pomona Mike, is a high-level Mexican mafia member who originally hailed from the Pomona 12th Street Sharkies. One of the things that should become inherently obvious to you guys as I walk you through some of these stories is that these stories are usually connected or associated with a specific member of the Mexican mafia. These are the standout guys that have went on to represent their neighborhoods or their barrios with a prestigious level of reverence and admiration for the accolades and personal attributes that they themselves have attained. Every neighborhood had a homeboy that stood out or became popular for one reason or another. He sold the most clavo, he had the most money, he had the prettiest girl, he had the best possessions, whether it was a lowrider or a bike, etc., etc. And this guy was always able to garner influence that was predicated off of one of these characteristics or traits. What I mean is this: in this lifestyle, we all started out as being just typical street level gang members. We might have came up being from different neighborhoods or different cities, whether it was from Northern California or Southern California. But we all started out with blank resumes, just being young gang members who drank the Kool-Aid and who became inspired by a belief system that was eventually ingrained within us. And some of us would end up getting lucky by finding a way out of the hood before it swallowed us up and ended up leading us to prison. On the other hand, there would be others that weren't as fortunate and would end up following that insidious path that would not only lead them to prison, but would also lead them to becoming permanent fixtures within this lifestyle. Maybe it was behind choices that we made in prison, who we became affiliated with, and what that commitment entailed. Or maybe because we picked up a case in prison that ultimately led to us catching a life sentence. It could be a number of different scenarios and possibilities. Most of us that are familiar with this lifestyle know that going to prison at some point or another is just part of the game. It's part of the lifestyle and it's inevitable. And then once you get there, what you do, who you become, what you get involved in is basically dependent on each individual himself. Going to prison in essence is a continuum or the next level of the journey for a lot of us. When some of us get there, we simply fall in line, we keep our heads down, and we do what we gotta do to make it back home. Then others, usually the ones that maintain some level of influence within our neighborhoods, that continue to build off of that reputation and become standouts within criminal organizations like the Mexican Mafia or the Nuestra Familia. As you guys know, most of the stories that I put out are about the Mexican Mafia, the Nuestra Familia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and occasionally the Black Guerrilla family. And in doing so, again, most of these stories are headlined or are connected to some of the members of these organizations that have become the standouts or some of the most prestigious members of these groups. Just to name a few examples, for Florencia, it was Tablas, Babo, and Topo. For the Avenues, it was Pee-wee and Psycho. For V&E, it was Chewy and Smokey. For 18th Street, it was Puppet and Huero Caballo. Popeye overseeing Harpies, and then finally, for Big Hazard, you had Danny Boy and Joker. So Pomona Mike from Pomona 12th Street was an individual that not only became a prestigious gang member from his neighborhood in Pomona, California, but he also became a pragmatic leader within the Mexican mafia. So he started out his career after going to prison for committing a murder with one of his younger brothers, Ruben, back in the 1980s. So at the time, Pomona and another rival gang, the Chino Sinners, were in the midst of a fierce gang rivalry. So one night, Pomona Mike and his brother Ruben, they drive into the Chino Sinners territory and they spot an individual who they recognize as being one of their rivals. So when they pull up on this guy, they jump out and then they confront him. And all Mike and his brother Ruben are thinking at that point is that this guy's got to go. So words are exchanged. At some point, a shotgun comes out. This guy ends up being shot and murked right on the spot. He probably didn't even know what hit him. So within minutes of the shooting, someone calls 911 after hearing the shotgun blast and after seeing this guy laid out. But after paramedics show up and they see this guy, they realize there's nothing that they can do. If any of you guys have ever seen someone get hit with a shotgun blast at point blank range, you understand why. So after committing this murking, Mike and his younger brother Ruben, they both plead out to the terms of a plea deal for second-degree murder. Then after they get sentenced, they're transported to the Southern California Reception Center, which at that time was Chino Prison. You know, believe it or not, Mike only ended up serving 4 years on this case, and soon after, he was eventually granted parole. So now with a wife and 2 children to support, Mike felt that his best chances of making it on the street would be to relocate and to move somewhere new so that he could start over, somewhere that was far away from his old haunts. So with aspirations to start over and to begin building a new life with his family, he moves out of Southern California entirely and begins building his new life in Sacramento, a place where he supposedly heard he could probably make it and stay out of trouble. However, Sacramento wasn't this prettied up city that someone led him to believe it was. It sure wasn't free of the gang element, and being that it was one of the bigger metropolitan cities in Northern California, it offered plenty of opportunities of its own for finding new ways to get in trouble. So Mike gets out of prison, he relocates, and he tries to live a legitimate life, if for no other reason, for the sole purpose of getting off parole and getting off of paper. Because at that point, he had practically been on parole for his entire adult life. But the legitimate life just wasn't for him, or he wasn't ready for it yet. Because after working at 9 to 5, he realized that the money just wasn't coming in fast enough. And some of his old habits started to resurface. He just got tired of being broke. You know, he was just used to making fast money. And the days when he remembered making $4,000 or $5,000 a day, it started to weigh on him. So eventually, he started slinging D again. Those old memories started pulling at him too hard. And even though he vowed that he'd keep it in moderation, even that didn't last for too long. At any rate, one of his regular customers, a guy named Randall Kastner, a guy he had been dealing with for a while, was broke and was severely dope sick. Apparently, this guy had no way of getting money to get himself well, and he had reached the bottom. So anyways, after this guy's better judgment had gotten completely away from him, and once he got to a point where he couldn't tolerate being dope sick anymore, he ended up robbing Pomona Mike at gunpoint for some black and a power tool that Pomona Mike had in the back of his truck. You know, this guy Randall, he wouldn't have done this under any other circumstances. But like I said, he had reached a critical point and he didn't care. He was sick, and all he was thinking about was trying to find a way to get himself better. So word got around on the streets that this had happened, and unfortunately for Pomona Mike, this ended up working against him. Because 2 weeks after this guy Randall robbed him, he was sitting in his car outside of a 7-Eleven in Sacramento when 2 guys pulled up next to him and shot him to death. Anyways, after a couple of overly zealous homicide detectives became aware of the circumstantial evidence in this case, they presented the case to a like-minded prosecutor who ended up charging Pomona Mike and his brother with that murking. So after seeing no logical way to overcome the evidence that they were using against him and his younger brother in this case, Pomona Mike struck a deal with the prosecutor that would end up sending him to prison for life under the condition that his younger brother be allowed to walk free. You know, this was an honorable thing to do, especially since his brother was younger than him. But not only that, at that point, Pomona Mike was already wrapped up deep in the prison politics, and his younger brother wasn't. You know, but unfortunately, despite the fact that he had good intentions of seeing his younger brother walk free, 12 years into Pomona Mike's life sentence, his younger brother ended up passing away. So as a result of that case, he ended up picking up a life sentence, and this is where he's been in custody for the last 40-something plus years. You know, and here's the thing about Pomona Mike. Pomona Mike wasn't the type of Mexican mafia member that attracted a lot of attention. For the most part, he spent decades in the shoe program, operating indiscriminately, keeping a low profile, and he avoided getting caught up in the messy power struggles or the political jostling that others who were vying for control were usually involved in. In his neighborhood, he's considered to be a mythical figure, a big homie, someone who's acquired a lot of status and influence over the years. And keep in mind that he's been down for so long that a lot of his younger homies, they've never even met him. They were still in diapers when he first went to prison. They've only heard stories about him, or heard his name, or seen him in pictures, but yet in their minds, he's still legendary. He's someone that they still admire and have a lot of respect for. And it's this same level of respect that's enabled him to collect street taxes in his neighborhood almost effortlessly. So from everything I've been able to gather, Pomona Mike has been delegated the responsibility of overseeing Pomona and the surrounding areas for years. Later on, he was also given Calipatria State Prison in Imperial County as well. And this is what he's been primarily focused on, establishing these two territories, expanding his operation, and generating money. And of course, since he's been incarcerated this entire time, he's obviously had to depend on other people to help him push this operation forward. This includes his pushers, his shakers, his tax collectors, his enforcers, his communication links, his buffers, and of course, his facilitators. It takes a lot of moving parts to keep an operation like this going. For those of you that are familiar with some of the protocols and what it entails to do something like this, then you understand that it's an arduous task. Especially when you're incarcerated, sometimes over 400 miles away, slammed down in the shoe with a very limited amount of resources. It definitely ain't no cakewalk, and it's a toilsome undertaking. It's not as easy as just sitting back, issuing out orders, and collecting the money as it comes in. And trust me, it becomes a game of chess, not checkers. And aside from the obvious, there's a lot of different things that you have to deal with. Establishing territory, managing your manpower and your COC, your chain of command. And then there's the monetary side of it. People getting busted, you having to find adequate replacements while maintaining a smooth transition, etc., etc., etc. I'm just giving you guys some of the basic concepts of what this stuff is premised on. I'm just giving you guys some of the basic concepts of what some of these things are premised on. Because each one of these concepts then branches off into 5 or 10 other directions that all have to be managed as well. And keep in mind, again, this is all being done from the confines of a prison cell where Pomona Mike and others like him in the 90s didn't have the convenience or luxury of cell phones or regular contact visits. And he had been operating in this capacity long before they started letting everyone out of the shoe. So it required a lot of strategy and focus. Because trust me, back in those days, there was a lot more that you had to overcome. The biggest and most pressing task was being able to continue operating your criminal enterprise while avoiding law enforcement detection. That was the hardest thing. And trust me, there was a lot involved with that. Everything from coded communications, identifying leaks and breaches, navigating through some of the cutthroat politics, knowing when somebody's working with law enforcement, etc., etc. I can go on and continue to tell you guys about the different possibilities and the different scenarios because there's so many different facets of it. And I had to navigate through some of that stuff myself. I didn't get to run around and play on the main lines. Unfortunately, this is why it becomes so difficult avoiding infiltration by law enforcement and eventually criminal indictments. Realistically, there's only so much you can do. You can cross all your T's, dot all your I's, and follow all the blueprints and the traditional methods of how others have done it in the past. But at the end of the day, you can only do so much. And unfortunately, this is why Pomona Mike faced that second indictment. If you look at the last 2 indictments that they hit him with, it wasn't because he was being recklessly overt with respects to the criminal activities that he was involved in, or it wasn't because he was speaking too openly on a recorded line like you guys hear in some of the other stories that involves wiretaps and surreptitious recording devices, because Pomona Mike was pretty discreet and low-key when it came to his street activities. I read both criminal indictments and I didn't see anything where you would say this was so erroneous or slipshod that he could have avoided it, or that this was done in haste. Because again, unfortunately, it was the mistakes of others that ended up getting Pomona Mike caught up. So in March of 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Mike and 12 other members of the Mexican Mafia and their associates with a multitude of felonies. Felonies that included racketeering conspiracy, robbery, kidnapping, extortion, violent crimes in aid of racketeering, vicar, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, and firearms offenses. So prosecutors alleged that Pomona Mike controlled lockups near the Oregon border and then later in downtown Los Angeles. And then trip on this, his federal criminal defense attorney, Mari Derby, said that prosecutors were perpetuating whispers in Pomona of a faraway prisoner who owns and runs the city. Then she went on to claim that they've had since 2012 to gather evidence about this evil genius, this guy named Michael Lerma, but yet there's no evidence and they haven't proven anything. So one of his co-defendants in one of the criminal indictments, a female named Cheryl Castaneda, was a high-level female associate who acted as a señora. She became a focal point of that indictment for utilizing her power on the street to solicit a murder and for participating in the carjacking attempt that resulted in someone getting shot. Cheryl was basically a high-level associate of the Mexican mafias who at times acted like she exerted as much power and control as Pomona Mike did himself, which unfortunately is an all too familiar theme. You know, I talked about this in some of my stories about the Nuestra Familia and how some women were allowed to maintain communication-based roles for leadership. You know, the problem with this is that some of these women lose sight of what their intended role is and the lines become blurred quick. This is something that I experienced firsthand myself. You know, most of the women that were assisting us were facilitators and communication hubs. They had specific roles, and this was back in the 1990s before everyone was let back out to the main lines and they had the convenience of using contraband cell phones. You know, communication was a lot more tedious in those years, and the facilitators were like the glue that kept us together. Back in those days, we depended on them to facilitate all the communications, and this was a vital part of us being able to operate effectively. You know, but the problems they started developing when some of these women started assuming that they were vested with the same type of power simply because they were either associated with leadership or they were intimately involved with somebody that was a part of leadership. You know, Pomona Mike and his circle experienced some of the same problems with Cheryl. She began talking to some of Mike's tax collectors and his enforcers like they were her personal minions, and almost like they were expected to acknowledge her as being some type of informal leader. You know, the fact that nobody stepped up to take corrective action didn't help the situation either. In fact, Cheryl became so comfortable in her role that she often made split-second impulsive life over death decisions herself when she wasn't able to reach Mike or someone else that was authorized to make those type of calls. And her entitlement came from the fact that she was Pomona Mike's wife's sister. But again, this included sanctioning green lights, having someone tuned up, or issuing hands-on discipline for acts of misconduct or breaking policy. You know, Cheryl knew that Pomona Mike held her in high regard, and she played on this and used it to her advantage because this was one of the perks that she knew that she had at her disposal. And when you keep giving someone like this rope, eventually they're gonna run with it. And in 2013, she finally tested the waters. She did this by using her power as Mike's voice on the streets to solicit the murking of a Los Angeles County Jail inmate in July of 2013. And she did this for her own personal reasons. She did it to retaliate against the person that shot her son on the streets. When the individual was hit for shooting her son and she found out that he was stabbed and that he wasn't murked, she got it approved by a Mexican mafia member to have this individual put on a hard candy list that marked him for death for the rest of his life. And then again, in the later part of 2013, Cheryl participated in the attempted theft of a Mercedes-Benz automobile that was owned by another inmate that was in the county jail. So when the car's caretaker refused to hand the vehicle over, she had one of her enforcers shoot this guy. And then later on, during the recorded wiretap phone call, she was actually heard laughing about that shooting on a recorded call. So Cheryl, she remained in her role as a señora for 4 years, from 2012 to 2016. And aside from her traditional and expected duties of collecting extortionate taxes from Pomona drug dealers, she was also in charge of distributing the drug proceeds to the Mexican Mafia leadership, which also included Pomona Mike as well. You know, like a lot of the other women that were allowed to take on more of a proactive role, she was also authorized with giving orders to others regarding the racketeering enterprise's criminal activities. You know, that's the one clear difference that I can honestly say between the Mexican Mafia and the Nuestra Familia. The Mexican Mafia allows women to take on lead roles in the capacity of what a señora is supposed to do. They even go as far as assigning them a title, that being a señora, which I definitely think invites confusion and a clear blurring of the lines. whereas the Nuestra Familia places limitations on the capacity of what a facilitator is supposed to do. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the NF has it figured out and that they're doing it right either, because even in light of these limitations, we were experiencing the same problems as well. Women were exploiting their roles. Anyways, this indictment also demonstrated Pomona Mike's vast control over all the street gangs in and around the surrounding areas of Pomona. He had that whole area on lock. So the following street gangs were just some of the street gangs that were contributing to the Mexican Mafia and Pomona Mike's taxation program. 12th Street Sharkies, Cherryville Pomona, CVP, Happy Town Pomona, HTP, Northside Pomona, Olive Street Pomona, Southside Pomona, and Westside Pomona. So like I said earlier, Mike was also in charge of collecting taxes from Calipatria State Prison as well. At the time, they had a pipeline in Calipatria where they were getting massive amounts of clavo in. They were getting in crisp, black, tobacco, and contraband cell phones. According to one of my sources, they had a steady market for crisp and black, and were able to smuggle in pounds through a compromised correctional officer. And although it might come as a surprise to some people, the most lucrative form of contraband that they were generating thousands and thousands of dollars from was contraband cell phones. I personally don't think this comes as any real big surprise, because despite the fact that there's a lot of people that indulge in D, everybody wants a cell phone. Not just because you can speak openly without having to worry about your conversation being used against you, but just also because of some of the other capabilities that some of these smartphones have. They're priceless, and depending on availability and access, they go from anywhere from $2,000 to $6,000. Collectively, there's a lot of money involved in that. Not just from selling the cell phones, but also from the CO that's bringing them in as well. So after being indicted the first time, the feds came back and tried to deliver the kill shot on Pomona Mike and some of his confederates. And this was all premised on the taxation program and the established activities he had in Calipatria State Prison. But before I get into the details of what happened with that case, let me take you guys back to 2004. So while he was still housed in Pelican Bay State Prison in the SHOOT program, Pomona Mike got a letter from one of his goddaughters. And the letter indicated that there was two guys from his neighborhood that were basically threatening their family. She goes on to identify these individuals as being Frankie Buelna, who was also known as Frankie B, and his right-hand man, Daniel Prendez, who also went by Danny Boy. So Frankie B was another well-known Mexican Mafia member that definitely knew better than to be disrespecting a fellow Mexican Mafia member's family. That was a no-no, and this was something that he was well aware of the fact that wasn't tolerated, as blood families were considered to be some of the Mexican Mafia's most purest reflections. I'm not aware of whether or not Frankie B knew that he was disrespecting Pomona Mike's blood family, but like I said, if he did, he was well aware of the consequences. Danny Boy, on the other hand, was just following Frankie B's lead. But at the end of the day, this wouldn't end up being a viable excuse for him either. So when all this was happening, Frankie B had just gotten out of prison, and he was out there on the streets shaking people down and using the Mexican Mafia's name as a cloak to scare and intimidate people. But understand this, Frankie B was also a righteous Mexican Mafia member, and he was well within his right of taxing people on the streets. However, the issue was that he was disrespecting Pomona Mike's goddaughter, as well as other internal issues that weren't related to this incident. So this went above and beyond what the naked eye could see, and there was more to it than people knew. Again, at that time, when Pomona Mike's goddaughter relayed that message to him, he was still housed in Pelican Bay SHOOT program, which obviously meant that all his communications were being closely monitored. So at the time, when gang investigators intercepted the letter, it definitely perked their interest, but it was baseless information that had no relevance. So they photocopied the letter and they processed it with the rest of the mail. However, not long after receiving this letter from his goddaughter, Pomona Mike responded by saying, "As for those assholes, not to worry. Things have a way of working themselves out in time." So again, when gang investigators read this, they didn't know how to interpret it, as it was open for interpretation. Although they made a note of it, like I said, this could have been just one Mexican Mafia member blowing steam off about another Mexican Mafia member behind his indiscretions. Or it could have meant something much more sinister, that he was going to get whacked for crossing that line. But under the circumstances, there was just no way of them definitively knowing what it meant. So about a year later, during the course of another investigation on the Pomona Sharkies, investigators tapped several phones of individuals that they presumed to be some of the street level leaders of Pomona 12th Street. And of course, they also assumed that these individuals would have been working under the auspices of Pomona Mike. In several of these conversations, it was claimed that word came down from the top leadership of the Mexican Mafia, authorizing these guys to send Frankie B to Brazil. So with this information in hand, federal authorities went to Frankie B and warned him that there was a very real and imminent threat on his life. And of course, Frankie B took it with a grain of salt and refused to believe it. Instead, he thanked them for giving him a heads up, and then he went on about his business. So needless to say, on November 13, 2007, Frankie B was at one of his favorite watering holes, a sports bar in Pomona called Character Sports Bar, when he was shot to death with Enrique Sanchez, one of his close associates. This ended up leading to several other investigations that also included the arrest of 4 individuals who were complicit in Frankie B's homicide. All of them were Pomona gang members, but Daryl Castrohone, who also went by Dashing D, was the one who was said to be in charge of the hit. So right before this happened, a federal indictment called Operation Fishnet was unsealed that resulted in 57 people being indicted. Others were either close associates or random people that assisted them with their criminal endeavors. Although the death of a highway patrol officer named Thomas Steiner precipitated the majority of this investigation, it also led to several offshoot investigations that the Pomona Sharky street gang was also involved in. I'm sure Pomona Mike was waiting to catch this chain and get pulled into this case as well, but as luck would have it, he slipped through the cracks and wasn't named in the indictment. Not because they didn't think he was involved, but more so because they couldn't prove it. However, in 2018, Pomona Mike was transported to the Metropolitan Detention Center to face federal racketeering charges with other Pomona gang members. So when he first got there, classification placed him and several of his co-defendants in a wing of the facility called 6 North, a place that looked more like a college dormitory than it did a cell block. This was an old part of the jail that had cells with wooden doors and windows, not bars. And like most jails, the inmates were given the liberty to decorate their walls with pictures of scantily clad women, stuffed magazine, maybe some soft Playboy shots, anything that made the cell look better and added a little bit of color to the concrete walls. So when Mike pulled up to the jail, there was an individual who had previously collected taxes from Mike on the streets. This individual was already there at the jail on an unrelated case. His name was Jose Martinez, but he was also known as Hoser. Later on, this guy would end up flipping and testifying against Pomona Mike and his co-defendants. And when he did testify, he gave detailed descriptions of how Pomona Mike was running the jail. He said you were expected to wake up early, suited and booted, work out and keep the house clean. And then he said that Mike literally controlled and dictated every part of the program in that jail. He turned it into his own empire. Even the deputies played up to him and were influenced by his status on some level. He said that non-compliant inmates were either beaten or stabbed and that everything went through Mike. He had everything under control. So Hoser talked about a time during the pandemic when Pomona Mike and his associates secured coveted orderly jobs that allowed them to roam the entire jail. They roamed the jail, they cleaned, and they delivered all the food while the rest of the inmates were locked up. So Hoser testified that they were only allowed out of their cell for 15 minutes a day, but that Pomona Mike and his associates stayed out all day. Then Hoser testified about Pomona Mike controlling the drug trade in 6 North. He said he controlled meth, black, and spice. He said Mike had the whole market cornered and nobody else was allowed to sell anything in that jail but him. So Hoser said that the markups were substantial. For a gram of meth that cost $20 on the streets, it cost $250 in the jail. And for a $25 gram of black on the streets, it went for $250 in the jail. So most of the inmates were required to pay up front unless they had some kind of credibility established. They either had to know someone or they had to prove that they were going to be there for a while. Others who were given issues on consignment were stabbed if they didn't pay the money back when they were supposed to. Also, if you were stabbed and you were allowed to stay in that part of the jail due to it being done in the form of punishment or in the context of an ominous warning, Mike wouldn't allow you to seek medical attention. And that was for obvious reasons, because if someone required medical attention after getting stabbed, obviously that would alert the deputies that someone had gotten assaulted. And if someone got assaulted, it would warrant the wrong kind of attention. So if they got stabbed, they were shit out of luck. They weren't allowed to get medical attention. You better either put a piece of tape on it or take a staple and sew it up old school style. So Holzer also testified about an incident where he was stabbed himself for not being able to pay back one of his debts. He said at one point he had been fronted $300 worth of Chris, and due to unforeseen circumstances, he wasn't able to pay it back. As a result, two of Pomona Mike's enforcers grabbed him by the arms and they walked him down to a cell where Pomona Mike and his cellie, Swifty, were waiting. So he said that as these two individuals were holding his arms as if they were stringing him up on a cross, they held him while Swifty stabbed him 12 times. And Holzer claimed that this happened when he was celled up with another individual by the name of Steve Benkham, who also went by the moniker Riskey and who was from a street gang called the King Cobras. So he testified about how he smeared coffee grounds into his wounds as a form of self-medicating. But again, he had to because Mike wouldn't allow him to get medical attention. So his cellie Riskey had a bad addiction to black and ended up running up a $4,500 debt to Pomona Mike. At one point, supposedly Riskey even had recycled money orders sent to Pomona Mike as a form to buy time, but this ended up backfiring. That's a ballsy move. For someone to send an active Mexican mafia member like Pomona Mike some bogus money orders just to buy time, he's asking for it. At another time, he got so desperate that he had his people doctor up a money account for him that showed he had bogus amounts of money on his books. Though this guy was a cold dope fiend, but he was playing himself real close. Then his time ended up running out. On the afternoon of June 28, 2020, Riskey and Holzer came out for their 15 minutes on the tier for their rec time. Riskey spent his entire 15 minutes on the phone calling everybody he knew, making call after call, begging anyone and everyone that he talked to help him pay this debt. After all his efforts ended up falling on deaf ears, Holzer testified that he saw Riskey hang up the phone and then he was pushed into their cell by Juan Sanchez, who was also known as Squeaks from Pomona. Squeaks was celled up with Pomona Mike, and he acted as his buffer. According to Holzer, Squeaks acted as Pomona Mike's buffer. Whatever Mike wanted done, followed up on it and made sure that it got done. He said he was fiercely loyal to him. So after Squeaks pushed Riskey into their cell, Valencia Gonzalez, who they called Swifty from Pomona, and his brother, Carlos Gonzalez, Popeye from Pomona, all followed him inside the cell. Holzer said that he knew that they were probably putting hands on Riskey, so he just stayed away from the cell and continued to stay out on the tier. And then he said that as they continued to beat him, they turned up the TVs in 6 North so that it would drown out the sound and any attempts made by Riskey to call for help. So about 10 minutes later, they all came out of the cell and it was time for him to lock it up. So he went back to his cell. And Holzer testified that as he was passing Pomona Mike's cell to go back and lock it up, Pomona Mike told him, "Hey, your cellie's a little bit tired. Go ahead and let him get some rest." So Holzer testified that after he went back to his cell, he found Riskey unresponsive on the bottom bunk and that he didn't call for help based on what Pomona Mike told him. He said he took it as a threat. Not only that, but before Swifty, Popeye, and Squeaks locked it up, Swifty came by his door and told him, "Hey, keep your mouth shut, dog, or you're gonna get the same treatment." So later on, a medical examiner from the Los Angeles Medical Examiner's Office determined that Riskey met his demise after being strangled and stabbed in the heart and eye. And based on statements that were made by some of the other inmates in 6 North, and other evidence that was obtained throughout the investigation, the medical examiner also theorized that Riskey had been pinned down and strangled with a ligature. He also theorized that Riskey had been stabbed in the heart and eye before he was strangled while he was still alive. And he based this on the pattern of defensive wounds as well as other medical findings such as blood coagulation and oxygen levels that were found in his heart. So according to Holzer, he was so scared that night that he just stayed up on his bunk and he didn't move. he was petrified. He said he considered going to his door and calling man down due to the physical state that his cellie Riskey was in, but that Pomona Mike had so much influence in that jail that he feared that this might somehow compromise his own safety. So when Hoser testified about the details of this day later on in the trial, he said that all he could hope for was that the deputies would come by during their count and would require both of them to stand up during count. You know, technically, they're supposed to make all the inmates physically stand up whenever they do their count. And they do this to make sure that everyone's alert, alive, and accounted for. But more often than not, they don't do it because it's too time consuming and it slows them down. And that's exactly what happened that night. Instead of coming by and forcing everybody to stand up during their routine count, the deputy came by during both counts and practically ran by his door. He said the deputy walked up and down the tier and then he was gone. So again, Hoser said instead of calling for help that night, he forced himself to go to sleep, despite knowing that there was a dead body in the cell with him. You know, imagine the morbid thoughts that must have been going through this guy's mind. All the nights preceding this incident, they had probably stayed up, chopping it up, talking about the streets every night. And then now there was nothing but silence. A macabre silence. So when Hoser woke up the following morning, he said that he looked down at Riskey and he noticed that he started to bloat and that the whole cell smelled like death. And at that point he said, I couldn't take it anymore and I didn't care what was going to happen. I had to get out of that cell. He said that being in the cell with a dead body for an entire night started to weigh in on him, and that one way or the other, he was getting out of that cell. So when the deputies let Hoser out the following morning to take a shower, he came out on the tier and he told deputies that his cellie was man down. He said that his cellie was man down, and despite the fact that he knew he was dead, he still told the deputy that he needed medical attention. So apparently one of the deputies walked into the cell to gauge Riskey's condition, and then a couple minutes later he came running out yelling that there was a dead body in the cell. So after removing Riskey's body from the cell and processing that whole unit as a crime scene that day, Mike Lerma, Pomona Mike, was charged with ordering Carlos Gonzalez, Popeye, Juan Sanchez Squeaks, and Jose Gonzalez Swifty to murk Riskey. You know, it shouldn't come as any real big surprise, but later on in the trial that Hoser testified in, the defense attorneys actually tried claiming that Hoser was untrustworthy, manipulative, that he was a dope fiend, that his credibility was shot out, and that it was really him that had killed Riskey. They tried claiming that Hoser murked Riskey during a drug-induced rage, and that he's a sophisticated, manipulative junkie that shouldn't be trusted. And alluding to the fact that there was no DNA or fingerprint evidence linking any of the defendants to the homicide they claimed was a testament of Hoser's guilt. Furthermore, they pointed to the records that were kept by the deputies that attested that Riskey was alive during both counts during the time that Hoser claimed that he was murked. But unfortunately, nobody believed this, including the prosecutor, Kyle Kanan, who said that the deputies at the Metropolitan Detention Center kept poor records, cut corners, broke policy, and didn't follow their own protocols. He went on to say that this trial has blown the lid off of one of the worst kept secrets that's been known here for quite some time at the Metropolitan Detention Center. And that's that the Mexican Mafia runs that facility. Not the deputies, not the Bureau of Prisons, but instead guys like Pomona Mike, who are some of the most sophisticated, pragmatic, cultivated, and polished inmates in the system. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and those of you who continue to tap into the channel. Until the next one, you guys continue pushing that positivity and enjoy the rest of your evening. And remember what I said, take the time out to let your loved ones know that they're important to you. With that being said, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.